Welcome to our final panel of the day and our final panel of the conference, the future of international prospects. And moderating today's panel is Rob Neyer. Rob's a senior baseball editor at foxsports.com. Rob joined Fox Sports in 2014 as its senior baseball editor after serving as the national baseball editor at SB Nation for 3 years. Prior to that, Rob spent 15 years covering Major League Baseball as a columnist at ESPN.com. Rob began his career as a research assistant for baseball author Bill James and later worked for Stats Inc. And now I'll turn it over to Rob.
Thank you, sir. As always, it's an honor to be here. I've been a SABR member for a long, long time, more than half my life. It's just it's a continuing pleasure, and it's always an honor to be asked to do these things. Our panelists, I'll give you the abbreviated versions. At the end, that's Jim Callis, senior writer with MLB.com and Pipeline. Jim previously worked for 23 years in 2 stints at Baseball America, and I guess Jim's been doing this for about as long as I've been a SABR member, so he's got some seniority on me. And I certainly spent many years reading Jim's work in BA. Next to him, Jonathan Mayo, senior writer at MLB.com. Of course, you see both these guys on TV all the time, especially around draft time, and I've known John for a long time as well for my visits to New York. And sitting next to me, Bryan Minniti. Bryan is a last-minute fill-in, which we really appreciate. Bryan spent 9 years with the Pirates in various capacities, then 5 years with the Nationals as an assistant GM, and he joined the Diamondbacks last October, so good luck this season. And before I get into my questions, first I have a mystery question that I haven't prepared them for. I'm going to throw it at them now, and then
16.
Give them a few. It's not a numerical answer. Give them a while to think about it. And the question is this: I'd like each of you to come up with an international prospect that you completely missed on, either positively or negatively, and what you learned from that. That's the important part of the question. The name's not as important as what what you learned from that in the aftermath. So we'll get that in a few minutes. First of all, Bryan, I'm hoping you can start us off by explaining as briefly as possible the relatively new rules governing international bonuses, spending pools, the penalties, etc.
Sure. So essentially, it's like the draft pools, reverse order of record. Each year, it's redistributed to the clubs. You're allowed to spend within your amount. Anything 0 to 5%, you're taxed on 100%. Anything from 5 to 10%, you're taxed on 100%, and then you're not allowed to sign a player the following signing period for more than $500,000. Any single player. Anything up to 15%, taxed 100% on the value that's over your limit, and not allowed to sign a player for $300,000 or greater than $300,000 in the following signing period. And then anything beyond 15%, same thing, taxed on the value 100% over the pool, and unable to sign a player for more than $300,000 for the following 2 signing periods.
Wow, that's amazing.
Did you get that?
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing is, compared to the draft, nobody wants to incur the maximum penalty, which in the draft would cost you 2 first-round picks. Nobody will touch that. I don't think anybody's ever going to go over 15% unless it's accidental, like the Astros almost did with Jacob Nix last year. But internationally, Bryan, your team did it. I think there's you guys, the Angels, the Rays, the Red Sox, and the Yankees are all shut out from signing players over $300,000 for the next 2 years. But I don't think any of the 5 teams regrets their decision at all.
No, I mean the big leagues, are full of players that from international markets that have been signed for a lot less than $300,000, and that's what you're hoping on, is that you have people in those areas that can pick players ultimately and sign them for a lot less.
And the thing is, it's not even Yasmani Tomas isn't even the reason you guys can't spend. And this part, I think the rule changed last year, but basically, if you're 23 years old or older, and I think you have now 5 years of experience in your nation's equivalent of a professional league, then you're not subject to the pool. So all these guys like Rusney Castillo, Yasmani Tomas, they don't even count versus this international pool, although I'm sure we'll talk about Yohan Moncada in a little bit. Yohan Moncada certainly did because he was 19 years old. So there's so many moving parts, and it seems like each year it changes a little bit too.
So presumably these rules were put in place, well, I shouldn't presume anything, but are the new rules doing what they were theoretically designed to do? Anyone want to speak to that?
I don't think they are really. I mean, I don't know if it's just because they're not quite as strict as the draft guidelines are that Jim was just talking about. Now, maybe it is to an extent, but I think that there are so many teams now that are willing to go over and incur some of those penalties. Even previously, I think the year before, with the Rangers went over because they knew, and it sounds like they even tried to time it with what else was going to happen in future years if you could have that kind of long-term planning. But I think that the basic idea of the system was to try to control spending on international amateurs, and that hasn't really happened. At least not to the extent that I think people thought it would.
The problem is that the systems are really different. In the draft, you can't try to grab, say, 2 or 3 years worth of talent in 1 year because nobody else is going to let you do that. You can't just overspend. You're going to have to pick the player too. Whereas internationally, you're not drafting the players. So if I want to call me the Yankees, I want to give 7 different players 7-figure bonuses last year. If I'm the top bidder, I can do that. I can get, so if I'm the Yankees, I'm looking at it like, well, I got probably 3 or 4 years worth of international talent all in 1 year. So even if I have to sit out 2 years of big-ticket guys, I'm ahead of the game. Or if I'm the Red Sox, who were already over before they got Yohan Moncada. They signed two pitchers last year to help put them over. But even if they hadn't, I know the Red Sox looked at Yohan Moncada as the equivalent of having the number 1 overall pick in the draft. And the difference internationally versus the draft is, in the draft, unless you have the worst record in baseball, you're not getting the number 1 pick. You can't trade for the number 1 pick, and you can't buy the number 1 pick. But internationally, if you want the best player, and money's no object, it could be yours no matter how you did. So it's, as Jonathan said, I think they did want to control spending, but because the two systems are different, you can't control it internationally like they hoped. And if you look at the CBA, there's language in there discussing international draft. If MLB had their way, there would have been an international draft 2 years into the CBA, but that required the union to sign off on it as well, which didn't happen. Although, I don't know what you guys think. I for years thought we'd never have an international draft because it would be so logistically a nightmare to try to administrate. But I think one's coming. I think one could be here as soon as the upcoming CBA. And I think it'll be like similar to the amateur draft in the last CBA, that it's something that MLB feels strongly about. Not something that you lock the players out over or anything like that, but it's not a hot burner issue for the union. So the union will be happy to give up concessions related to an international draft in order to get something for their membership, because the international players aren't even union members.
Yeah, the international market, it's a free market system in that regard. It's not like the draft where you can really cap spending. They could have been even harder on that if they had wanted to. Just because you draft a player, you're the only team that can negotiate with them. But internationally, you have 30 teams potentially trying to vie for the services of one player, and that can drive bidding up. And it is harder to cap that when you have that kind of free market system in place.
So if we had an international draft, let me back up a little bit. It's been theorized, I'm not sure I buy it, that adding Puerto Rican players to the domestic draft has hurt the talent base, the talent pool there. Do you see any significant impact of an international draft on the talent pool?
I do. I would be concerned about it. It's hard to say that it didn't have an impact in Puerto Rico, but I think the people that are out there now able to sign for the highest bonus, or whoever's willing to give them the most money. We have a lot of people that are incentivized to, be a better trainer, be a better player, that type of thing. I think when you take away the top end from those folks, it has a chance to kind of water things down a little bit. That would be my concern.
I think it would depend on what the rules were too, because the issue I believe in Puerto Rico was when they put Puerto Ricans in the draft. I believe before they were in the draft, they were treated like other Latin Americans, where you could sign them at age 16. When they went to the draft, they were treated like U.S. players in the draft, where you have to be a high school senior, typically 18 or 19 years old. And I know the theory, talking to people who were around when the rule changed, was that by making players wait an extra 2 years to sign, they weren't getting as developed as early, not just on the field, but in terms of nutrition, eating better, developing, physically as well as on the field. So that would be an issue. That said, I don't think internationally they're talking about switching the ages that you would make all the Dominicans and Venezuelans and Colombians. I don't think they're going to have to wait till 18 necessarily if they were an international draft. Although there's any number of problems that could be created. It'd be very interesting if you have an international draft and the international draft age is 16 and the U.S. draft age remains essentially 18 or 19 as a high school senior, what happens the next time the next Bryce Harper comes along and he's ready to turn pro at age 16? How do you justify, well, these guys can sign at 16, but you can't sign until you're 18?
We could see a player for the first time ever move from the U.S. to another country, theoretically.
I don't know how easy it is to renounce your citizenship and establish it elsewhere, but but you could. And I mean, you have the whole issue. Do you have a separate draft? Do you have a combined draft? Do you work in, the Tanakas and the Abreus, the older players who aren't part of this? Are they going to be part of the draft?
Well, and each country has, you go to Venezuela or you go to the Dominican, they do things entirely differently, and they're very possessive about how they do things. So getting them all in line, yes, I agree with Jim, that it sounds like we're moving in that direction. I don't understand how it's going to work.
I feel sorry for whoever's in charge of trying to administrate that, because it's going to be a nightmare.
Meant to tell you.
You could argue, couldn't you, that if a draft is a lousy idea internationally, it's also a lousy idea in the States?
Well, I think, and maybe I shouldn't say this working for MLB, but the draft,
That was why
the
I punted.
public reason for having a draft is to divide talent equally among teams. But the real reason the draft was created and it perpetuates is to keep the cost down on these players. If they were free agents, they'd cost a lot more. So that's why we have a draft. I don't think it's necessarily the most efficient system, but that's why we have a draft in all sports. Not necessarily an issue of fairness. It's because in general, when all these drafts were created, the owners didn't want to pay free agent prices for these guys. You go back and look just at the draft. You look at when Steven Strasburg, had back in the days where you could spend anything you want in the draft, he had the largest commitment ever, which was a little bit over a $15 million major league contract. And you look at, Rusney Castillo's getting $72.5 million. And I'd submit that Steven Strasburg had proven more than Rusney Castillo when he signed. Or you go back to 1996 when Chris Benson was the number one pick in the draft and one considered by some to be the best college pitching prospect ever. He got $2 million. Travis Lee was the number 2 pick, and he became a free agent through this long loophole I won't get into now. And Travis Lee got $10 million. So, that's the main reason you have the draft. If you didn't have a draft, Brian's team has the number 1 pick in the draft this year, and I think the slot's a little over $8 million, and the guy doesn't always get that slot. But right now, the favorite for that pick, I think, would be this high school shortstop named Brendan Rodgers. So I could see Brendan Rodgers getting, a number that begins with a 7. But if Brendan Rodgers was a free agent and anybody could get him, the Yankees and Red Sox and Cubs or whoever want a shot at him, Brendan Rodgers might get $35 or $40 million.
Right.
So the draft isn't necessarily efficient, but it's in there to keep those prices down.
But, they've now demonstrated that they can have another system to regulate how the players are signed with the international players. You could do the same thing theoretically and hold the cost down to the same degree. You'd have to think with the penalties, clearly. But is there any particular reason why a draft makes more sense than what they're doing now with international players?
I think the only reason you would have it is to control costs. I think that, at the end of the day, it's heavy-handed, but if you want to play in our league, these are our rules, and you have to enter the draft through this process. That would work. It'd just be cumbersome. But I think the only way you would do it, or the only reason you would do it, is to try and control costs and have some parity.
You might have chaos. If you didn't have a draft, and let's say it was more of spending limits like you had internationally, there'd be nothing to stop, say, I'll use the Cubs as an example. The Cubs are a team that has money. They have a great farm system. They're building their club up. Their hitting prospects are ahead of their pitching prospects. There'd be nothing to stop the Cubs from saying, we'll do what teams are doing internationally. We'll go out and we'll get the top 5 pitchers in this year's draft, and we'll spend $20 million or $30 million on them. And okay, we won't have first-round pick. We'll have spending limits the next 2 years. But as long as you feel like you're getting more than your share of talent up front, you can go ahead and punt the next couple of years.
There's an irony now, because it wasn't that long ago that especially people representing players from Latin America were complaining because the kids coming out of the draft are getting so much money and hadn't done anything, and now it's completely flipped around where you have kids in the drafts are complaining that the Latino players coming are getting too much money. I mean, Jim quoted some of the contracts. You know, if Yohan Moncada was coming out of the draft as a high schooler, he would max out at $8 million. If you play with your slot money, maybe you could cobble together $10 million if you have a deep pool, but that's as deep as you could go. By the same token, Brendan Rodgers or Michael Matuella or whoever might end up being the number one pick, there's only so far you could go. But if we're an open market, Brendan Rodgers was a shortstop coming out of Venezuela. Who knows how much money he would get?
I mean, if you go looking back at Bryce Harper and Steven Strasburg, I think those guys would have gotten $50 million plus.
Easy.
If they were free agents, if not more. Just because, again, if I'm the Yankees, I have no limits. You know, you see what the Yankees spend on free agents. Why wouldn't I give that to somebody like Steven Strasburg, who then I'd control his big league rights for 6 years?
Yep.
So let's talk about a couple of countries where the landscape is changing. Venezuela was, I believe, second on the list last year. Last year there were 224 foreign-born players on opening day rosters, 26% of the major leagues. Dominican Republic obviously was first. Venezuela was second, 59 players. They've made the visa process more difficult. There's been a report that the Mariners are pulling out, basically, leaving only 4 teams with academies down there. So we might be seeing fewer players, or at least more difficulties in player development there. Meanwhile, last year there were 19 Cubans on opening day rosters, which was a record. I would assume we're going to have a new record this time around, and probably a new record the year after that. So you can choose, or you could talk about both, but maybe a little bit about the changing landscapes in Venezuela and Cuba and what those places look like 3, 4, 5 years from now, the talent pools.
I think in Venezuela it's just becoming more and more difficult for foreign entities to operate. I think it's become more and more unsafe, unfortunately. A lot of things that are going on with just the kind of the black market with currency and hotel rates and food and all like that. It's actually. I know it was with the Nationals, and a couple of the guys are here, but we had an issue where a scout didn't go to a workout one day because there was a car on fire at the end of a street and a lot of activity and some guns and whatnot. So, it's just become even unsafe for some of the locals to do their jobs, and I think that obviously prevents you from seeing players like you ordinarily would have. It definitely prevents people from outside of the country coming in to see players. I think it. At the end of the day, you're going to find a way to see these guys, but it's probably going to end up where, like a lot of teams are, bringing their teams that were in Venezuela into the Dominican and maybe having a second team or whatever. But I think it's just become more and more difficult to operate there, unfortunately.
So they're signing players when they're 16 and then bringing them to the Dominican to play?
Yeah.
Because it's safer. And I think there's some thought that if it doesn't get better or safer or more welcoming, I don't think the pipeline will dry up. I mean, you said the 59 guys in opening day rosters, and I think there were 97 total guys last season from Venezuela in the big leagues at one point, and there's a number of top prospects as well. And I think what you'll probably see is those players will leave Venezuela so they can sign. It might be somewhat akin to what Cuba is now. I don't know if they won't defect per se, but like if you're a young Venezuelan and you want to sign, you'll leave the country and go to the Dominican or come to the U.S., not necessarily defect or seek asylum, but work out for teams and then sign, because there's too much talent down there and there's too much money being made by agents and handlers and those types of things. I don't think anybody's just going to say, well, we aren't going to see these guys anymore. It's going to be come to the Dominican or come to Mexico. We want, come someplace where we can work you out and evaluate you, and then we'll still sign you. So I think it may be a different reality with the Venezuelans, 5 years down the road than it is now. But I don't think we'll see necessarily fewer Venezuelans in the big leagues or in the pipelines coming. I mean, you're talking about there's Felix Hernandez, Miguel Cabrera, Jose Altuve. I mean, there's so many Venezuelan stars. I don't think it's going to be like Cuba was when Castro took power in the late 50s, where you just stopped having Cuban players for 20 or 30 years at all. I mean, I think it was Barbero Garbe in the 80s, and then I was just starting at Baseball America. I think Rene Arocha defected in like 92, right. But you just didn't have Cuban players. I don't think we'll see that with Venezuela. I think we'll still have them, but they may leave the country to showcase what they can do and sign if people can't go see them.
I think this: if you're a trainer in Venezuela or even in the Dominican, and the the system is not the most ethical, I think would be the best way to put it. But there are sort of quasi-agents that are in Latin America. But if I'm someone who is trying to represent and make money by having these players sign, I would start funneling them into the Dominican and into Mexico so you can get paid. I mean, and the bottom line is, you want to get these players up, and those guys want to get paid. If I were an ambitious trainer there, and it's difficult for teams and for scouts to get to Venezuela to see them, then I would start moving them.
So now Cuba, I'm going to maybe first ask a really simple question. As I said last year, there were 19 Cubans on Major League opening day rosters. I don't know how many, maybe Jim, you know how many overall there were over the course of the season, but 19 on opening day rosters. 5 years from now, what is that number? Starting down, just each of you give an estimate. Jim?
I could see it maybe being doubled. I mean, if it's open market and you can sign whoever you want, I mean, there's veteran players like Yulesky Gurriel and Alfredo de España. There's younger guys like Victor Mesa, Jorge Ruiz. There's a kid who's been overshadowed by Moncada named Andy Ibanez, who's going to be very wealthy very soon. There's a couple of teenage pitchers who may or may not, via registration and regulations by MLB, may be eligible to sign before July 2. In the coming year, or maybe 2 years from now, Yadier Alvarez is the most prominent of those guys. The pitching down there are some pitchers, but the pitching in general is not real strong. But when you look, what's really been a marked difference for me is, again, when I started Baseball America in '89, there were no Cuban defectors. Barbera Garbe was like the exception to the rule. And then there was a trickling of defectors, and most of them didn't live up to expectations, whether it was Arocho or Arroyo. And Livan Hernandez had a good career, but he wasn't the ace everybody thought he was going to be. El Duque might be the exception. But now you look at Cespedes and Puig and Abreu and Chapman, and it's like all these guys are getting big contracts and delivering right away. That you're looking at guys, Brian's team, they signed two guys. They signed Yasmani Tomas to make an immediate impact, and Yohan Lopez, who might need a year in the minors, but will make a pretty quick impact. I mean, you're getting guys who are fairly ready to step in, and it's like a nice alternative to the major league free agent market. Goes through the roof because the supply and the demand don't line up. I mean, teams have more money, so they're letting fewer guys get to the free agent market. So when they do, you pay through the nose for them. So anyway, I think there will be, if it's open season on Cubans, you're going to see those guys signed left and right. And teams, I don't know exactly what the regulations are. Like I don't know how thoroughly you're supposed to scout these guys, because technically you're not supposed to sign them until they defect. But all 30 teams are prepared. Nobody's waiting for
they're familiar with
the policy to be changed. And they're like, okay, now we'll go scout these guys. Everybody knows, like if today it was decreed that, okay, all Cubans are fair game, teams would know who they want and be ready to make a move.
What's your guess is about 40?
Then that's just off the top of my head. Maybe it would be more than that. Maybe it would be 50 or 60.
I'll take the over. Yeah, I think it's going to be a little bit north of that, because while there's been this uptick already in terms of guys signing, we're not even touching that market in terms of the 16-year-olds. We're waiting until they've played somewhere, maybe in international play and things like that, and that's really been the only way to evaluate these guys before then. If there's an open market there and people can come and go, and you're going to start seeing resources spent there by teams in terms of sending scouts there to watch players when they're younger. So I think you're going to see a larger influx of Cuban players overall into baseball here, into the minor leagues. And it's going to start maybe taking away from the guys who come in and sign and end up in the big leagues almost immediately. They're going to follow the more path that the Dominicans and Venezuelan players have followed.
Brian?
I would agree with Jonathan. I think it's going to probably eventually levels off with Dominicans and Venezuelans, but I think you'll probably see an increase. I think that's a good point. You'll start signing the younger guys and things like that. And in terms of how we scout them, I think that between all the international tournaments, youth amateur things like that, World Baseball Classic or the Caribbean Series with the team being included every year, that's how you get so familiar with them. I'm sure there are a few teams that are sneaking some guys in across the border, but I would say largely that's where you see all these guys. And then, of course, the second they defect, everybody sees them, immediately.
A couple more questions from me, and then we'll take yours. So again, if you'd like to submit a question in the back, you can do that. So briefly answer this one, please, each of you. Say 10 years from now, let's go, you can go 15 or 20 if you'd like, if you want to be creative. Where's the new talent pipeline? Not outside of Latin America. I shouldn't say what is a new talent pipeline that right now we're not really tapping at all, or hasn't been tapped because the talent hasn't been there?
I think more European countries. I think, the problem is that there's been no youth infrastructure in a lot of places and commitment to that. And I think the more that that's built up, and I know, Little League and whatnot have spent a lot of money in that over the years, and they continue to spend more and more. I think as those programs are, in place for longer, you're going to see more and more players signing from the countries where Little League's a big thing, whether it's Germany or whatever. I think you'll see more guys from Europe.
I think that's probably the best bet. I remember when I first started at MLB.com, almost 16 years ago, I did a story on the African Baseball Federation and how teams were kind of tiptoeing into some countries there. And it's not that I expected some explosion of, players from Ghana or anything like that, but I thought there might be some more activity there, and there really hasn't been to this point. So I don't even really know how active Major League Baseball is there now. But that would have been my other choice. But I think places like the Netherlands, where there's already been some players who've had at least a modicum of success in professional baseball here, I could see there being a continued pipeline from there.
Yeah, I guess my answer would be, I don't know if there's an obvious one, because like Brian said, I think the infrastructure is the key. You really need a country where baseball matters a lot and kids are playing at a very young age. And it's a national passion. Even the Netherlands, it's really Curaçao and the Netherlands Antilles. It's not Holland that's producing, these guys. And when I started Baseball America, I remember going to the Goodwill games, and the Soviet Union had these grand designs to be a baseball power, and they were going to, have this large population. You hear kind of the same things about, China and China's potential, but unless you get to the point where people in China care about baseball and it's something that kids want to play, and you get a good infrastructure set up, I don't know if that changes. I mean, we've seen some Europeans, MLB has a European academy, but again, I mean, unless it's kind of, baseball over there is probably far less important than soccer is in the U.S. So I don't know if there will necessarily be a brave new frontier unless you get someplace that suddenly starts caring about baseball. Australia, when I started my early days of Baseball America, Australia was starting to percolate, and everybody was speculating this could be this great source of talent. And, it produces some players, but it's not a passion in Australia. You don't have millions and millions of kids playing, so then you're getting the cream of the you're getting the cream of the crop in Europe, but that crop in Europe might be the cream of a couple hundred players, who are seriously playing the sport. You need millions, or hundreds of thousands to really make it something to rival the Dominican or Venezuela or Cuba or the United States or whatever.
Well, this, it seems like an empirical question to some degree, because you could track youth participation in these different countries. On the other hand, the Dominican Republic is a tiny country, and yet, we have this huge output. So it can't be just about numbers,
Well,
right?
but it's a passion, the Dominican. Everybody plays baseball, and they play it, not 24/7, but
Close.
Hours and hours a day, 7 days a week, pretty much year-round. That's not happening in China. Even though the Dominican has a fraction of the population of China, I'll bet the Dominican, as a whole, plays more baseball on a yearly basis by far than China does as a whole. So it's really getting, not just setting up the infrastructure, you have to make people care enough to want to play. And I don't think that's easier. I think it's a lot easier said than done. I remember we were all kids, soccer was starting to become more popular, and it's a lot more popular than when I was a kid, but you aren't seeing, the U.S. hasn't won a World Cup or really challenged to win a World Cup, and you aren't seeing U.S. players all over the world dominating, and we're better than we were 20 years ago, and it's the same thing. I don't think, China would be the obvious answer if you could make everybody care, right. And they have the economy is doing well there, and if they're playing, but I don't think that's going to happen. So not to be negative, but I don't know if there's you can just flick that switch on and make people care, because I think that it's that passion that really drives it.
Jim's a lot older than Brian and me, so when he talks about soccer, it's a whole different era.
I would agree. I think it's not about the numbers necessarily. It's about, it probably goes for any sport, but the countries that are best at baseball are the ones where kids play all the time. whether it's year-round or whatever. So I think that's a big deal. And I think the movie Comrades of Summer killed baseball in Russia, in my argument.
So, Brian, I'm putting you on the spot first with your international prospect you missed on.
It's probably a really long list. Domestic, too, for God's sake. I don't know, we miss on guys all the damn time. I think you could probably look across the league that any player who signed for, less than $100,000, which there are a bunch, that didn't sign with the team I worked for and classify them as a miss. I think it just highlights, and I don't mean to be so vague with that, but I mean, it's just there, you could probably go through, you could probably list 20 names in every one of them. I think that generally speaking, it's really a premium to have people in any country that can scout players and identify talent. I think I was fortunate to work in Pittsburgh and Washington with some guys who can do it, and obviously hopefully in Arizona as well, but guys who were able to sign major league players for a lot less than most people do. So that said, you're going to spend a lot of money on players that stink too. It's kind of part of the nature of it. So,
Jonathan?
So I automatically thought of guys that I missed on in terms of them not being who everybody thought they were, and I'll pick one. I think the guy that first comes to mind is Andy Marte, who was going to be the next great third baseman. He was a Braves prospect for, I don't know, feels like 24 years. He's still playing baseball, and he actually made it up to the big leagues and contributed last year. I remember when I saw box scores with his name on, I'm like, wait, that Andy Marte? Because I remember doing stories on him when he was coming up through the minors, and he just never figured it out. The other guy that sort of just popped into mind, and Brian and I used to live in Pittsburgh together, and he talks about their staff, and it's not that I missed on him necessarily, but Gregory Polanco was signed for, I think, $15,000. He was a pitcher. And the Pirates Latin American scouting director, Rene Gallo, said, well, he can't pitch, but he's really athletic. I think we should try him out as an outfielder. And, he made it up last year and contributed, and is going to be their everyday right fielder. So that's not a guy I necessarily missed on, but the industry probably did.
And, I've never in my 25 years covering stuff had the international beat as my beat. So it's not like I cover these guys at the time. So it's more evaluating them after they've signed and been in the minors and come to the U.S. Ben Badler, Baseball American, Jesse Sanchez at MLB.com are the guys who cover that. But I think where mistakes are made when you're signing these guys, it's so much more difficult. When you're signing, like, say, a Dominican kid or a Venezuelan kid compared to a U.S. kid, you're basically signing these guys from the high school sophomores. So you're having to project them. It's hard enough in the draft, even college guys, but you're projecting the guys so much further into the future than you are with a domestic kid. You're generally evaluating these players in showcases, in workouts. Here he's taking BP and swinging for the fences and running a 60 or throwing to the gun rather than actually how those tools play in games. You know a lot more, in most cases with the American kids, about their makeup, how they're going to handle the American culture. But all that said, like Brian said, there's any number of guys who've signed cheap. Jose Altuve was a $15,000 signing for the Astros, and I'll admit, even when I saw him in the Futures game, I thought he had a chance to maybe be a big league regular. I don't think I ever pegged him as a future batting champion or an all-star. I mean, just because he's so small. And I think for a miss, I think back to mid-'90s, we had Ruben Rivera on the cover of Baseball America. Ruben Rivera, the next Mickey Mantle, and we had him ranked ahead of Derek Jeter on the top 100 prospects list. And he had unbelievable tools, and I don't think we necessarily, or I necessarily underestimated Altuve and overestimated Rivera because they were, international players. I think a lot of people underestimated Dustin Pedroia, who's a little second baseman who swung from his heels. And there's been a lot of, great domestic players. I just think, if there's a lesson to be learned there, it's the great players come in all shapes and sizes, and there's a lot of guys with great tools who don't become great players.
So the next short second baseman you're not going to underestimate?
No, because the funny thing now is everybody compares. Everybody has got some guy who's like a Dustin Pedroia clone.
The next Dustin Pedroia.
And it's just like in every every right-hander who was more of a finesse guy was a Greg Maddux type guy. Well, or every guy who had pinpoint control as a lefty was the next Tom Glavine. Those guys are the 99 percentile. Those are the exceptions to the rule. There are no next Dustin Pedroia. Dustin Pedroia, if you could measure his hand-eye coordination, like if you could quantify it, it might be as good as it gets. I mean, I don't know how you see a guy who swings with that swing from his heels every time and yet barrels the ball repeatedly. If you were looking for more guys like that, 99 times out of 100, you get guys who'd be swinging and missing all the time. So it's
probably a good challenge for this room. How about it?
I just thought of another guy. It's funny because you talked about, Jose Altuve doesn't look the part, and then I thought of Joel Guzman. I think he's a guy because he never even played a day in the big leagues, I don't think, and
$2 million guy.
He looked the part. I mean, he was a toolsy shortstop. He was on a really, really talented Dodgers. I remember that Double-A team, that Russell Martin and James Loney and Chad Billingsley and Andy LaRoche. It was like a crazy, crazy minor league team, and Joel Guzman was the best prospect on that team, and he never sniffed the big leagues.
So I'm not exactly sure where the question is in my next subject, but I'm pretty sure that you guys can come up with something. The difference between young players in the U.S. and in, for example, the Dominican Republic is massive in terms of what their training is like, right? A 12-year-old in the U.S. is on a travel team, swings a $300 bat, and many of them have personal coaches. And the same kid in the Dominican, not that I've been there, but presumably a lot of them are playing on the streets with their friends, and you hear the stories about the balls made out of tape and what have you. And I'm just wondering if you guys can talk about that a little and how that affects their development as young players, how that might affect scouting them, projecting them, the whole range of opinions we might have about them going from the ages of 12 to 16 in the case of a Dominican player when he gets signed, or 18, 19 as a U.S. player.
I don't think the equipment's necessarily as huge a factor as it might appear to be. I mean, you always hear stories about like Vladimir Guerrero swinging at, I think, bottle caps and seeds and, honing his bat and honing his skills that way. I think it's more the reps that are important, because the Dominican kids in particular play so much that they develop, instincts and they develop skills. I think if you could change one thing, I'd be interested in what Bryan would say about this, but if you could change one thing, if a big league team could change one thing, like that you could give Dominican kids to make them better, I think you'd be talking about nutrition, really, so that they were stronger and healthier. The bats are nice, but like Dominicans aren't having any trouble producing very talented players despite, having nowhere near the equipment that the rich kids in the suburbs of the United States would have. So I don't think that's so much a factor. But if you could somehow get like they already do, but extend it younger. If you could bring kids into your academies from they were 12 years old and work with them for 4 years and educate them and give them nutrition and better prepare them to come to the United States, then that might make a very interesting impact.
Might be some teams doing that now. So I think that's probably true. I think nutrition, education level, things like that make a big difference in how they, move on with their lives, whether it's in the academy or in your system, towns in the United States, that type of thing. I think nutrition's a big deal. Hygiene, dental hygiene, little things like that we probably take for granted. But anybody who's been around Rene Gallo for more than 5 minutes has probably heard his story about signing then Fausto Carmona and his bad teeth, and when they got his teeth fixed and nutrition put some pounds on him, he started throwing about 7 or 8 miles an hour harder and became a guy. So those types of things happen, and I think that's a really good point.
I think you can flip it around though, because I think the one problem with amateur baseball here is that too many of these guys don't really know how to play baseball. They have their coaches and they play in all these showcases and they can light up a radar gun or they can run a great 60, or when they do infield, outfield, they show a great arm, but they have no feel for playing the game of baseball. And I think the kids that are coming over from the Dominican and Venezuela, that's all they do. They have often, and this is painting with a really broad brush, but they often have a much better feel for the game as a result. And I remember seeing this one player in particular I'm thinking of, and he was a high school kid, actually a son of a big leaguer, and he was chiseled already in high school, just looked like that multi-tooled, prototypical right fielder. And if you watched batting practice at a showcase, he put on a show. And the outfield just BBs to home plate. And then they play in a game and he'd go 0 for 4 with 3 strikeouts. He took horrible routes to fly balls. He just didn't have a feel for the game. And I think that's the one downside to the advantages, the advantages aren't always advantageous.
Well, let me ask you this, all three of you. Who gets more reps, a 13-year-old player in the Dominican Republic or in the U.S.? And top guys, I mean.
It might be a push these days. I don't know. I mean, the way that all this youth baseball is going, but I can't answer that. I don't know.
They have the benefit that everyone from the Dominican Republic, the weather's all the same, while in the United States it's so varied.
Right.
If you live in the Northeast, forget it. I mean, that's why Mike Trout is so extraordinary and why people missed on him is because people couldn't even see him. And you had to wait to see some of those guys. So it might come about even, but I might give a slight nod to the kids in the Dominican. Now, they're not playing as organized, and maybe it's not as high level. And we talked a little bit about the equipment, maybe not making that big of an impact, but they don't have the same kind of equipment. So I think it's almost an apples and oranges kind of thing.
It's less structured, and that can be both good and bad. I mean, you have the freedom to go out and play. You can grab, you can get a pickup game going, and I don't think you see too many pickup games in the U.S. as much. It's all highly regimented travel teams, and who are you going to play for in the summer, and who are you going to play for in the fall, that type of thing.
I think in player development, you can often polish guys and get them to the big leagues who maybe don't have the inherent athleticism and skills to play there. But I think generally speaking, if you have those, no matter where you come from, you're going to find your way there.
I have some great questions. I'm going to start getting into those. Brian, I'm going to ask you to read the first one because I'm afraid I'll butcher the name. Do you know this guy?
We're just going to go with the last name only. Question is, when he's posted in the next few years, what is the chance that Ohtani can be a two-way player in Major League Baseball, as he is in Japan? Let's see. I guess I should answer that as the management shill. You know what? It's interesting. I mean, with Brooks Kieschnick and Rick Ankiel, I don't know, are the ones that come to mind. There aren't many people who do it, certainly at the same time. We can all think of pitchers who can hit. I think if he's that good, it'll play itself out, and maybe he'll get the opportunities because we're all kind of talent whores on some level. But I think because we have a tendency to do this as an industry, we'll outsmart ourselves and make him one or the other.
Yeah, and I don't even know if it's outsmarting yourself, because you could outsmart yourself by letting him try to do both ways, and then he doesn't fully develop either way. And because Ohtani is not going to come cheap when he comes over, but Kieschnick was more of kind of a not a novelty, but more of a relief pitcher, pinch hitter. He wasn't a regular guy both ways. But I think back, and I'm not this old because I didn't see him play in college, but Dave Winfield was gifted enough to do both. But you don't want to mess him up as an outfielder by having him fool around with pitching. John Olerud probably could have been a lefty reliever, and there's a number of guys. But my guess is that when Ohtani comes over, he'll get posted. It'll be, who knows what rules we'll have in place, but he'll probably max out just about what you can pay him, and it will be as a pitcher. I just don't think anybody – it's so hard to keep pitchers healthy anyway. Do you want to have him dividing his attention and then maybe spending time trying to make it as a hitter, and you don't do enough strengthening the arm or conditioning, and then he blows his arm out, and then what do you have? So
probably let him pitch until he breaks, and then let him hit.
Yeah,
I'm going to remember you said that, by the way. I think it's going to be the same kind of deal that you have with two-way guys in high school or college, where it's going to be beholden to the evaluators to find out, first of all, what does he want to do? Because you may have a guy who's much better at one thing than the other, but if he doesn't want to do the thing that he's better at, then you're wasting your time. Maybe you have to try to convince him. I thought the Red Sox with Casey Kelly handled that really well. Casey Kelly wanted to be a shortstop. And they said, all right, well, here's the deal. We'll let you go out and play half the year, your first full year as a shortstop, and then we want to put you on the mound. And he said, okay. And he went out and hit about, $190, and played a decent shortstop. Then they really pushed for him to be in the futures game that first year as a pitcher. So they kind of gently nudged him, and he was a smart enough kid to say, all right, clearly my future is on the mound, and unfortunately he's had elbow problems. But, I agree. I think Ohtani's probably a pitcher, but you got to make sure he wants to, if he's got to pick one, that's the one he's going to want to pick.
How good a hitter is he?
I have no idea.
I haven't followed his hitting career in Japan, but the guy throws in the upper 90s, so I find it hard to believe that any big league club is going to not want him on the mound.
Right.
So,
Brian, what does the future of Colombian baseball look like?
Hopefully more like Venezuela, Dominican, and Cuba. But I mean, we'll go anywhere for talent. That's for sure. So I think they've always produced some level of players, and hopefully that'll just keep growing.
Is the youth baseball getting bigger there?
I can't speak to the growth, but
Uh-huh.
I think hopefully everywhere.
How has the WBC affected international scouting?
I mean, it's allowed teams to see guys more frequently, maybe that they hadn't seen or at all, or don't see that often, particularly the Cubans, and some of the Japanese players as well. It just gives extra looks.
And I think it gives them looks with the bright lights, with the lights, on.
And better competition,
and
too.
then against better competition. So maybe you would have seen a kid, even from one of those baseball playing countries that's big, but they get a chance to step up and face major league pitchers from the United States, and you see them compete at that level, and it gives you a better understanding. And it's not even necessarily what the results are. A guy doesn't have to go out in the World Baseball Classic and hit 4 home runs, but if he has good at-bats against a guy who's much higher level of competition, then suddenly you're like, wow, he can handle that kind of situation, and that might bode well for his future.
Daisuke Matsuzaka performed very well in the World Baseball Classic. I don't know how he performed, but Aroldis Chapman, not surprisingly, lit up the radar gun at the World Baseball Classic. And like Bryan was saying, I mean, the Cubans especially, it's not like you can just hop on a plane and go to Havana and check out some Cuban players if you feel like it, but it gives you more access to them. Like Jonathan was saying, with the Japanese players, you get to see them. I don't know if anybody has a precise measurement of how good are the Japanese major leagues compared to the U.S. major leagues, but even though it's a small sample size, you get to see the Japanese players against mostly major league competition. It gets you it's an interesting look. The last World Baseball Classic, the Dutch team with the guys Profar and Scope and Bogarts, even though they were very young, you could kind of see what they could do. It gives those guys a little bit more exposure. So I don't think it. I don't know if anybody's really a secret, when they get to World Baseball Classic, but it allows you to get a lot better look at some of those guys than you normally would.
Would baseball and maybe the prospects as well benefit from raising the international signing age to 17?
Well, that goes back to what we were saying about Puerto Rico. I mean, I think you'd have some people tell you that it would do the opposite, that by making guys wait, that's another year where you don't get to deal with their nutrition and hygiene and health and education. And, at least with Puerto Rico, when people talk about Puerto Rico drying up for a number of years, they felt that was the single biggest factor, was that instead of being able to sign them as 16-year-olds, you had to draft them as 18-year-olds, and that had a huge negative effect. So would you probably miss less often? Sure, because the guys are a year older. They'd be a little bit easier to project, although you're talking about high school juniors versus high school sophomores, so there's no sure things. But it could have a negative effect overall. That would be my guess.
What about the Rule 5 eligibility clock? Doesn't that play a role too there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more based on their performance or the talent level, wherever they are. But I would agree. I think, I guess more often than not, these guys aren't coming from the best background, whether it's nutrition-wise or education. So it's not like you're necessarily getting a more mature player at 17 than you are at 16. And that's giving you one less year to have your hands on them and hopefully make them better. So I would agree.
And ever since they changed the rules of the Rule 5 draft, Rob, to your point, where the teams have that extra year to evaluate them once they're in their system, it's not become. I don't think that's as big of a deciding factor for anything anymore. And you're seeing fewer and fewer impact guys go in the Rule 5 draft anyway. So I don't know, a year here or there is going to make that much of a difference in terms of the amount of good Rule 5 eligible players.
So what about the cultural and language barriers with international players? I know teams have done a lot more work in the last decade for sure. Do you see that as having made a difference in how these guys develop as 18, 19, 20-year-olds?
You guys interview them. You could probably answer that just as well as I can.
I was going to say, you're the team guy. So
yeah, no, I think so. I think that, at the end of the day, it's whether or not they can play, no matter what they speak or whatever. I think maybe if it helps their assimilation and helps them reach their talent level or whatever, I think that helps. I think, maybe it's helping them with their teammates if they're able to speak the language or whatever. I think it's hard to say. I mean, if they can play, they can play. It doesn't really matter. But I do think that that there's definitely value, and teams have put a lot of money into helping these kids, whether it's with translators, so they have someone with them, or cultural liaisons, or just teaching English. I think it's really helped the players grow. A lot of teams, I mean, the Diamondbacks have a pretty extensive high school program for our players. Where even after they're done playing, they can still continue to go to school kind of on our dime. And a lot of teams have modified versions of that. I think it's a really nice idea. It's like a lot of programs, you end up spending a lot of time on maybe the players who can't play, which is okay. I mean, if your investment in it is more, as much a cultural impact as anything else. So I think at the end of the day, if these guys can play, they can play, and they find their way there. But all these little things I think do help, and the players that typically embrace these things do benefit from it.
I think the one thing it does, just like with the rookie career development program in general for players that are already in minor league systems, is that if you have a player with talent, you want to do everything possible to make sure that there isn't anything non-playing related that trips them up. And it can be a whole host of things, but I think for kids coming from another country and they're young and then they suddenly have to go to the Midwest League and you're this 18-year-old kid from the Dominican and you're living in Iowa.
You should write a movie about that.
What?
They should write a movie about
maybe
called Sugar.
Call it Sugar, yeah, something. That's a good idea. Let's work on that after this. Have people seen that movie? I highly recommend it. Actually, I think it's a very well done film in terms of trying to depict, what that's like. And obviously it's over dramatized and things of that nature, but they do a good job of it. You might have a kid who's really, really talented on the field, but if he feels completely like a fish out of water when he's not playing baseball, it can cause some issues. I mean, as much as we talk about players in terms of what they can do on the field and almost as commodities, we've been talking about how much money they get and things like that. They're human beings, and that gets forgotten a lot. And I think a lot of the improvements that teams have made in these programs to teach them the language, to just tell them how to do normal things that we take for granted because we speak the language and we've lived here, can help them. It maximizes the probability of them reaching their potential.
And also, I would say that even for the guys who don't make it, I think in the 20 or 25 years I've been covering this stuff, I think there's a lot more compassion for these guys. When I started, it was kind of, I think, not every team, I'm not going to paint a broad brush, but it was, okay, we'll bring these guys in. If they don't pan out, we'll cut them. And you sign these kids, not everybody's getting $72 million contracts. Some of these guys are signing for $10,000 or $15,000. If they don't make it, they go back home. And, if you don't educate them or try to help them, you really are doing the player a disservice. Just because he doesn't help your big league club doesn't mean that the team doesn't have a responsibility to the player. And I think, I think that's been a big change in the last couple of decades. Is I think teams now realize and embrace that responsibility that, hey, a lot of these guys aren't going to make it, and some of these guys we may not have, hundreds or thousands or millions of dollars invested in, but we still owe it to the player to try to, help him with his education, help him, with his health, help him so that if we cut him, after 2 years, he's not just cast adrift. And I think that's been a really positive change.
Kind of along those same lines, a couple of months ago, the Dodgers announced they would have a Spanish-speaking coach with every minor league affiliate, and I sort of hit my forehead and said, "What? Of course, but everybody isn't already doing that." It just seems like such an obvious thing. But you can imagine what it would be like to be a Spanish-speaking player and have no coach or manager who spoke your language, how difficult that would be. I would assume that within 5 years, everybody will have that.
I mean, generally, the teams that don't, you at least have a trainer or a player who's bilingual who can translate. I can't think, maybe it exists, of a situation where you have Spanish-speaking players who don't speak English who have nobody to help them. But yeah, it is kind of amazing to think that wouldn't be standard or, but yeah, I don't know if we'll see every team have that in 5 years, but it's certainly something to aspire to. Again, it's like Jonathan was saying, if you can do anything to eliminate anything that might trip up a player, if you have somebody who can actually translate what the coach is trying to convey into your native language so you understand it fully, that's a positive.
And by the way, for job seekers out there, people always ask about this, not this panel, but learn Spanish, right? Isn't that a
Definitely.
pretty good first move? You can start doing that in junior high. Read Bill James and learn Spanish. Those are your assignments.
Now, if you
you're-
can read
if
Bill
you're
James
13.
in Spanish, then you're really ahead of the game.
All right, one more question. This is a complete wild card. If anyone answers correctly or acceptably to this audience, you win some sort of prize. Why are there so few left-handed hitting and throwing players in the Dominican, relatively speaking?
Well, a lot of them are infielders, so I mean that's going to eliminate your left-handed throwers. That's the only thing that jumps to my mind is, I mean, when you think of Dominican players, you think of shortstops. At least I do first and foremost. You think of shortstops, but there's certainly no reason you couldn't play the infield and hit left-handed.
Catchers, too.
Yeah.
No, that's a good question.
Although as a lefty, I still don't understand why you couldn't have a left-handed catcher.
That's a
As
whole
long-
other subject. We could
Yeah.
go half an hour about that.
We'll be doing, that's our panel next year. We'll be talking about left-handed hitting, left-handed catchers, because,
Left-hand throwing catchers.
yeah, left-handed, because
Have
Jim
any of you
and
ever
I are both
seen-
left-handed, so.
Have any of you ever seen one in even high school baseball?
No.
Not in high school. I caught in Little League. Does that count?
I mean, that seems bizarre to me that you wouldn't see one in high school at some point.
Well, the problem, starting off, we don't have to get sidetracked, is good luck finding a left-handed catcher's
They
mitt.
make them. You can order them.
You can make them.
get
You have to
them.
order them, but you're going to have to special order them. Those
Right.
aren't cheap. So it's
So
if you're a
uh,
left-hander, you're
getting
you get
back
put in another
to
position.
the actual question. As fascinating as it is to relive my Little League days, you know, I think if there is a certain amount of emulation that goes on, and they're looking at the shortstops that are playing in the big leagues and things of that nature, I wonder how many times when a kid first picks up a ball, whoever it is that is supervising, whoever it is with, is continually putting it in their right hand. I wonder if there are some actual left-handers floating around in professional baseball playing right-handed.
It's a little known fact. There are less than 100 left-handed gloves in the Dominican Republic.
Really?
No, I don't.
I'm sure
you
to
win.
win a prize.
Brian gets the award.
You sold that. That was good.
Well, thanks, guys. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you.